So good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to be with you all. For those of you that I don't know personally, I am Rory Picker-Nice. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in St. Louis. And we are so excited to partner today with the Israel Center at the Jewish Federation of St. Louis to bring you this fabulous program. I know I have 1,000 questions and I have no idea what's going on. And so luckily, instead of spending a lot of time on Google, it's always great to kind of turn to our, I was gonna say resident experts, but you're not here, but in the Zoom world, we're all everywhere. So to our resident experts, and really honored to partner with the Israel Policy Forum to bring this update today. So just so that you all know the order of what's going to happen, I am going to introduce David Halperin, who's our speaker today. I have some questions that I'm really excited to be asking him, but we want this to really be an opportunity for all of you to ask your questions as well. So at any point in the program, you are welcome to put your question into the chat, and I will be going through the chat and making sure that those questions, that you have a chance to ask them. If you would prefer to ask your question and be unmuted, you're not able to unmute yourselves, but I can unmute you, or some of my handy co-hosts here. So if you would like to ask a question yourself, then you can either, I think there should be a way that you can raise your hand, or you can just type your name into the chat. We're going to try to go through as many of the questions as we possibly can. So with that, let me introduce David. David Halperin is the Executive Director of the Israel Policy Forum. Previously, he was a reporter in Israel for English edition of Haaretz. His opinion writings have appeared in a variety of publications, including the Jerusalem Post, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, the New York Times, Haaretz, the New York Jewish Week, and others. He received a BA from the University of Arizona and a master's degree in public policy from Columbia University's School for International and Public Affairs, where he was a member of the International Fellows Program. He's originally from Phoenix, Arizona, and he lives with his wife and 2 children in New York City. And we were reminiscing a bit, because many of you might not know this, but most important about all of this is that I started my whole career with David at Israel Policy. I mean, he was already there. My internship in college was with the Israel Policy Forum what were you saying, like 2 buildings ago, or multiple offices ago, and things like that. But
different lifetime ago, yes.
So we were allowed to ask questions about my sophomore year of college as well. I guess that's all on the table. So again, for anyone who's just coming in, if you have any questions, you should feel free to put them into the chat, or to raise your hand, and we'll try to get through all of your questions. But let me just start, David, by saying there's all of this talk about this new government, and is it a done deal? Like, where even are we? Are there still more votes to happen? Like, before we even talk about what it is, where are we in the process?
Great. So thanks, Rory, and thanks everyone for taking time to kind of unpack this together. There is still time. This is not a done deal, but the timeline is now clear between where we are now and to it becoming a done deal. It has been announced that the special session of the Knesset will convene this coming Sunday at 4 p.m. Israel time. At that time, there will be first a vote to replace the current Speaker of the Knesset, Yariv Levin from the Likud party. He is likely to be replaced by the new Knesset Speaker will be one from Yesh Atid, from Yair Lapid's party. That will then set in motion a number of speeches ending with a vote of confidence. First, you're going to hear from Naftali Bennett as the presumptive incoming Prime Minister, laying out the formation of what the government will look like, what roles will be in that government, and what the coalition agreement consists of. That's a point that I'm going to come back to in a moment, this coalition agreement, which is a critical part of this process. After Naftali Bennett speaks, the presumptive opposition leader will give a speech, this being Benjamin Netanyahu, will give his case as to why this government should not be sworn in, and then you will have a vote of confidence in this new government. That vote of confidence will be the moment of truth on whether the Likud and the current parties that are left out of this coalition agreement, predominantly the Likud party and some of the religious parties, that will be the moment of truth as to whether they will have succeeded between now and that vote in convincing one member of Knesset who is part of this coalition agreement to defect, eliminating the possibility that the incoming government will have the 61 seats needed to form a majority in the 120-seat Knesset. Now, before all this happens, there was a bit of drama over scheduling this vote to begin with, because as I mentioned, the current Knesset speaker, the current individual tasked with setting that schedule, Yariv Levin, is a member of the Likud party and was seeking to stall this vote for as long as possible so as to enable more time to pass for particularly the Likud to make efforts to pressure members of this emerging coalition to defect and to buy time in the hopes that this agreement would begin to unravel. So here's a little bit of the strategy by Levin and the Likud party, is that rather than schedule this vote on Monday, which is the last possible day that it could have been scheduled, we're seeing it scheduled on Sunday. And so the question is, why is it on Sunday and not on Monday, which is actually the last possible period? It's because according to law, before the vote of confidence in a new government can be formed, there needs to be a 24-hour period in which the coalition agreement is made public. Okay, so a day in advance of that vote, when the coalition agreements need to be made public so that the Knesset members can evaluate them and determine whether they're voting a vote of confidence. By scheduling this on Sunday rather than Monday, it means that the coalition agreements need to be made public on Friday before Shabbat, giving another full day for the Likud party to make all sorts of waves in the media, exposing, look at what the Yamina party members, Naftali Bennett's members, have agreed to in this coalition agreement to try to increase the public pressure. It gives them an extra 24 hours to build that public pressure before the vote of confidence. If it had been scheduled on Monday, then the coalition agreement would have been publicly launched on Sunday, and it would have only been 24 hours of mayhem. Instead, we're likely to see 48. We're likely to see a not very restful Shabbat, let's just put it that way, while there's efforts to upend this emerging coalition. So that's the timeline. We're going to see on Friday the coalition agreements, and we're going to see a blitz in the media saying, oh my gosh, look at what they've agreed to. This is outrageous. Lots of pressure building. And then again, the moment of truth will be at 4 p.m. Israel time on Sunday, starting with a speech by Naftali Bennett, what will be likely a very dramatic speech by potentially the opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, and then ultimately the vote of confidence. Once that vote of confidence is taken, if indeed they maintain the current 61-seat majority that it appears they have, you will then have, at that moment, Naftali Bennett sworn in, taking effectively the oath, and sworn in as Israel's new prime minister, ending Benjamin Netanyahu's current 12-year run as prime minister.
So this is a super niche comment, but I'm seeing like a lot of rabbis who have also been commenting about how not only do you have this Shabbat piece, but that it's the Parshat of Korach, which is all about a fight over leadership over the Israelite people and rebellion, which also tied in with the giant sinkhole in Jerusalem. Side note. So there's like if your rabbis are looking for jokes this weekend, there's a lot to go on with it. So what is the government like? Tell us what can we expect to see?
So actually, we have a great graphic that our team put together that I think is like the best way to visualize this rather than me just sharing it. So I'm going to share my screen to just share a graphic that it really helps to summarize all of this. You all can see this on the screen, I hope? Yes?
I can.
Good. Okay, good. So as you can see in this sort of one-page graphic, this is Israel's new government. Of course, Naftali Bennett is slated to be prime minister, even though that he is sitting with a party with only 6 seats in this 61-seat government. He, under the rotation agreement, would be prime minister until August 2023, at which point Yair Lapid would then become prime minister, where Yair Lapid will start in the position of foreign minister, as you can see. Yair Lapid, of course, is really the strongest party in the government by far at 17 seats. followed by Kahol Lavan at 8 seats, which is perhaps one of the surprises of the last election. After the split up of the previous blue and white party, Benny Gantz emerges with 8 seats and will maintain his position as defense minister. He was just in the United States in Washington earlier, I believe this week, speaking about sort of the replenishing Iron Dome and the like. He will maintain that position as defense minister. And as we go through and unpack, I think it maybe is helpful, Rory, to just think about why people are in these roles. Like, how did this actually come about? And when you think about so many of these characters, so many of these players, one by one, I don't want to necessarily get into the full weeds, but we could tell stories about each one of them and how in the past 5, 6, 7 years, they have been jilted by Benjamin Netanyahu. Whether it's Benny Gantz, who just recently had agreed to a rotation agreement with Netanyahu, where the one loophole was that if they don't pass a budget, the government will fall and they'll go back to elections. And of course, Netanyahu went for that loophole so as not to rotate the prime ministership. Naftali Bennett begins his career as Netanyahu's cabinet minister. Cabinet secretary, has a famous falling out with Naftali Bennett and his wife, Avigdor Lieberman. Just a few years ago, the Likud and Yisrael Beitenu parties had an alliance, which was the Likud Beitenu party, if you all recall, for a brief moment in time. And Avigdor Lieberman was Netanyahu's defense minister. Lieberman, by refusing to join a Netanyahu coalition after the first election in this series, is what began this series of 4 elections that we've had unto this point. Lieberman comes with deep distrust of Netanyahu. Ayelet Shaked, another former secretary of Naftali Bennett, who has had a falling out. The list goes on and on. Gidon Sa'ar, who had a falling out with Netanyahu within the Likud party. And you can once again see just in this imagery and a few of the headshots that we can see here, that it is very clear that as you go one by one, the stories are not only political disagreements. In fact, in most cases, there's not political disagreements between Netanyahu and many of these. These are personal matters of deep distrust, and nobody believes Netanyahu anymore, which is why they have come together, because they just don't buy what Netanyahu is selling in terms of forming a government with Netanyahu, that he will actually deliver on what he's offering. But as you can see, Lieberman will take the role of finance, Shaked as interior minister, and you can see some of the notable spots, Gidon Sa'ar at justice and Meirav Michaeli at transportation. You think we are going to see we can talk a little bit in greater depth about different aspects of I'm sure you'll have questions about foreign policy, the Palestinian issue, and domestic religion and state. I'm happy to dig into the implications of all of this. But it's also notable to see that the biggest bloc of parties here is still the bloc represented by Yesh Atid and Kahol Lavan. The original joint Kahol Lavan party, representing 25 seats, is really the anchor of this coalition, even as the right-wing party Yamina is going to be in the prime minister seat for the first 2 years. And of course, we have the unprecedented inclusion of Ra'am, the United Arab Party, representing really the Islamist faction of those parties representing Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is rather unprecedented, and it demonstrates just how diverse is this coalition. What's notable is that we have a national unity government, not only that is diverse, going all the way from Islamist faction to the staunch national religious right-wing faction of Yamina, but also that this is the first time that we have a national unity government that does not represent the 2 largest factions in the Knesset. If you think about the rotation in the mid 1980s between Shamir and Peres, that was based on the 2 major parties of Likud and Labor coming together to form the heart of a national unity government. This is the first time that we see such a diverse coalition representing a unity government that actually leaves the largest party in the Knesset outside of the government, and that, of course, being the Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is slated to be the new opposition leader. So maybe I'll stop there and take questions about all of this.
So I got a question in the chat asking if this is the most women in the Knesset.
I don't believe it's the, I actually, I don't know if it's the most women in the Knesset. I believe it's the most women ministers in a cabinet.
In the cabinet, I should have said in the cabinet.
I believe it is the most women ministers in a cabinet. Having said that, if you all saw this famous picture, maybe I could Google and pull it up for a moment, but there is a remarkable picture that was printed just a couple of days ago of all of the party leaders representing this unprecedented coalition. And I will say it is still incredibly male dominant when we look at who the party leaders are, with the exception of Merav Michaeli leading the Labor Party. Each one of the parties making up this coalition agreement is still led by men, though it is notable that there is an unprecedented amount of women inside the cabinet and who are ministers.
So with this breakdown, I mean, with this new government, what would we expect in terms of some of the priorities that they would have? You know, what are we, not that you can totally predict the future, but to make you predict the future, what might we be seeing coming out of this new government?
Yeah, so I think that first and foremost, there's going to be the ultimate test of the coalition is going to be their passing a budget. We've had this unprecedented political deadlock in Israel now for the last couple of years. Israel is still operating on the budget that was passed in 2018. There has been no new budget allocations even through the COVID pandemic issues. So passing a budget will be the first and urgent task of this government. And I believe that actually on matters of domestic consequence, particularly of some of the financial allocations, you're going to see this government want to work together to pass that budget in a rather effective way, where you're going to see that because it's so diverse and because it really every single member of this coalition is essentially a king that can bring down the coalition at any moment in time. What you're likely to see is not a lot of dramatic moves in any direction on, frankly, any issue. Having said that, there is going to be tremendous amount of desire to ensure that this government does not quickly fall in order to see us head back to another election, a fifth election, and particularly if you are Naftali Bennett and you've just made a massive political gamble between the choice was going to a fifth election in which Naftali Bennett may very well have not made it into the Knesset. That was option number one. And option number two was becoming Prime Minister of Israel. But in becoming Prime Minister of Israel, you are effectively becoming, you know, in the eyes of many on the right, a traitor, right? Letting Naftali Bennett fall. And it's not even clear today who Naftali Bennett's base is, if he still has one. And so from Naftali Bennett's perspective, and particularly as the prime minister of the first part of this rotation, there'll be a great interest to show that he can deliver, that he does not want this to fall. He does not want to be the failure that goes to a fifth election and effectively ends his political career. Yair Lapid will have an interest in this coalition surviving in order to see the prime minister's seat in 2023. Yes, to prevent Netanyahu's return. And again, while Netanyahu is the glue that has brought this bizarre cast of characters together, he will continue to be the glue that keeps it together, because the fear of the fear of Benjamin Netanyahu returning to the prime minister's chair is essentially what will be the goodwill that keeps this group together. Having said that, because it is such a small majority, again, any unforeseen issues or any particular squabbles at any moment in time when there appears to be a political interest could ultimately bring down this government. And so it's not clear that we'll make it to August 2023 to see Yair Lapid in that rotation. But I do think that at least initially there will be a lot of goodwill and a lot of desire to keep this going for as long as possible to prevent Netanyahu's imminent return. And I think that along the way we have to acknowledge there's landmines all over. Okay, from domestic issues, certainly to foreign policy issues. And one can look to next Tuesday, where for those who have been following the news, you may recall that the sort of perfect storm day that led to Hamas capitalizing on tensions to fire rockets at Israel and leading to this round of a conflict that we had between Israel and Hamas just last month. It took place at the end of Ramadan, on Jerusalem Day, at the day when these homes were slated to be, the Palestinians were slated to be evicted from this particular Jerusalem neighborhood. All of this was happening at the same time as Jerusalem Day, where you have far right-wing nationalists marching through the Muslim quarter of the Old City. And this particular timing was also at the conclusion of Ramadan, creating this perfect storm of tensions in the Old City. And ultimately at the 11th hour, that march had been postponed, even as Hamas began firing those rockets. There was an effort to reschedule that march to take place this coming Thursday, widely viewed as part of the growing pressure campaign on the right to build pressure against the formation of this coalition. They were denied the approval to march this Thursday. It has now been rescheduled with approval for next Tuesday, 2 days after this new government is formed. And again, if we see tensions arising in Jerusalem and the potential for renewed ties between Jews and Arabs, Palestinians and Israelis in the city, we've seen that can spill over. And it is those moments of uncertainty and potential tension on the Palestinian issue, vis-a-vis Hamas and otherwise, that will really test the viability of the goodwill of this coalition to stay together. You can recall just a few weeks ago when Naftali Bennett removed himself from negotiations on forming exactly this government because of the Hamas rocket fire, in which he said he was not prepared to form such a government. That I think is something to watch even in the coming days as tensions potentially escalate around this nationalist march through Jerusalem.
So there's a lot in all of that, and as while we're looking at the graphic, there's just what I want to highlight in what you're saying, and I guess just to make sure that I'm following also, is that because I'm hearing a lot of discussions about Naftali Bennett being further to the right than Bibi, than Benjamin Netanyahu, and yet likely to lead over one of the most centrist, I don't know if that's the right term, governments that we might be seeing in recent history.
That's right. First, I think Naftali Bennett, it is, like I said, that he had a clear choice, which is risk the end of his political career or become prime minister. And so I think that he chose this gamble that he could elevate his profile in national politics for the future. I think that Naftali Bennett has clearly distinguished himself as being to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu. I've had meetings with Naftali Bennett in the past, and he said this actually publicly, but I once had a meeting where he said this to me privately as well, where he would say that he was setting the tone for the right-wing ideology. In other words, that Benjamin Netanyahu was increasingly concerned that Bennett was outflanking him from the right. And he had this joke that he would say often, which is that whatever I say, Netanyahu then says 2 weeks later. And his joke was that if I say that Israel should annex Baghdad, Netanyahu will say that we should annex Baghdad. And then he would joke, but I'm not going to try to annex Baghdad. He really was trying to set what the right-wing flank needs to be in order for Netanyahu to cater more to that right-leaning audience. He really popularized this idea that the right-wing vision should be a full annexation of Area C of the West Bank, constituting 60% of the West Bank, and that is now rather commonplace in the national right-wing discourse. That is a program and a policy that will be absolutely impossible to advance under such a coalition, including Yair Lapid, let alone including Meretz and Labor. We are not going to be able to see so much of this right-wing ideology that Naftali Bennett has been his stock in trade, and frankly, his base has very much been within the West Bank, within the settler movement. And that goes back to my earlier comment that it's not even clear who Naftali Bennett's base is anymore, because number one, he was being threatened with not passing the electoral threshold to begin with. And just as a reminder, we've had 4 elections. In the second election in this round of 4, Naftali Bennett did not make it to the Knesset. But now that he has joined this diverse coalition, many of those who would be his traditional voters are abandoning him. And so I don't think that he is going to change his ideology. He is very vocal in his opposition to a 2-state solution. We are not likely to see any significant moves in either direction, whether towards the right-wing advancement of a right-wing ideology, or much of an advancement, frankly, of a more left-wing viewpoint in terms of proactively engaging in measures to advance a 2-state solution either. What will be one of the source of trickiness for this coalition, again, thinking about what are some of the stumbling blocks, particularly on the Palestinian issue, will be the issues of Jerusalem, where we have court cases, Supreme Court cases that are part of the judicial process now that all seem pointed towards the eventual eviction of Palestinians from homes in East Jerusalem, in both the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. These are the 2 areas that the Biden administration has been very vocal about, that they do not want to see these evictions take place. But again, to take this out of the realm of the Supreme Court and to find a solution to at least stall this matter, if not make it go away in some way, shape, or form, will require political leadership from the Israeli government. And is Naftali Bennett prepared to strike those sorts of deals when it's dealing with the very politically sensitive issue of Jerusalem is highly questionable. So the story of Jerusalem and the growing tensions of Jerusalem, I don't think are going away in the near term. And in fact, we're going to see the opposite. We're going to see Netanyahu, as the opposition leader, make a point at every stage to now outflank Bennett to his right, to do exactly what Bennett was trying to do before. We're going to see Netanyahu continuously say, look at what Bennett's not doing to advance the right-wing agenda. And we're going to hear it loud, often, and, in not nice terms, but repeatedly. Yeah.
So with that, so maybe we can stop sharing so we can see you a little bit. No, this has been great because I want to shift away from the coalition itself, because I'm getting a whole bunch of questions about Netanyahu, and specifically, does he stay head of Likud after this? I mean, after he's delivered this huge blow to Likud, what are the odds that he does stay as the opposition leader? And I think the corollary to all of that is, what happens with his trial?
So on the first, I think we've all been watching a very similar movie play itself out after the election of Biden and Trump, and the question of the Republican Party and whether Trump would be the standard bearer of that party. We're going to see the same kind of discussions happening within the Likud party. And I think that we're likely to not see Netanyahu be unseated as head of the Likud. In fact, I think we're likely to see very quickly, if Netanyahu becomes the opposition leader, we're likely to very quickly have a call for a new Likud primary vote on party leadership, in which Netanyahu will very quickly seek to receive a renewed mandate as the head of the Likud party. We may see some challengers emerge. I fully expect they will not be successful. Netanyahu's hold on the Likud party is incredibly firm. There is a deep core of supporters that are standing by Netanyahu. And Netanyahu in recent days gave a speech in which he used phrases and described this election in terms that we would be very, very familiar with, having experienced the last 7-8 months of American politics, saying that this election was fraudulent, saying that the media, of course, is all colluding against him, and that of course he this is all essentially a sham. Now, why is he saying it's fraudulent? Because he points out that Naftali Bennett repeatedly in the election campaign said that he would not join a government with Yair Lapid, and of course he's turning around to do just that. So it's nothing about actual election fraud. It's about his claiming that Bennett is not staying true to what he promised. But we're seeing that I don't expect Netanyahu to go anywhere. And the second question about his trial, it makes the situation far more difficult for Netanyahu in that he no longer has the option of what he was trying to do this entire time with the 4 elections, was to get a solid right-wing majority that might pass legislation that would create immunity for himself from prosecution. This is something that he really sought and was unable to obtain. And it's been very clear that that was not really in the cards for the last couple of elections. Now, as a member of the opposition, that certainly is off the table. His prosecution, the trial proceedings will proceed. And the real serious threat facing Netanyahu is that at the end of the day, he could even face prison time. Having said that, this trial is not quick. There are a lot of complicated issues in the cases that are faced against him, and many think that this could be another 2 to 3 years to play itself out before we're actually getting into the judgment and sentencing phase of things. And so again, if you're thinking about what's Netanyahu's lifeline, political lifeline and get out of jail card, it's to return as quickly as possible to the prime minister chair, try to get that majority and try to create a new avenue towards future immunity. All that is to say that I would expect that not only will Netanyahu be the leader of the Likud party, but he will be a fierce and very rabidly right-wing, but fiercely vocal opposition leader who will do all he can to upend this government once it is formed in order to give him a shot to come back, even while facing an ongoing trial.
So there's a few people who have been asking, because you said that so much of what's keeping this coalition together is, sorry, my phone's ringing. So much of what's keeping this coalition together is this desire to unseat Netanyahu, and what happens to that glue if Netanyahu goes away. But what I'm hearing you say then is that Netanyahu is not likely to go away, which actually, even as he's working to undermine this coalition, that in and of itself might be what keeps the coalition moving forward.
That's exactly right. I don't expect he's going to go away. We may see some emerging challenges. We may see chatter. We may see some Liz Cheney's, if I'm going to make the connection, right? But I don't think that he's going anywhere anytime soon. I think his power base within the Likud party is just way, way too strong for him to be unseated as the head of Likud. And I will say that there were times, at least reported in the last couple of weeks, where Netanyahu was offering that others would be prime minister first in a rotation, right? He was signaling to the public a willing to take a back seat. The problem with that strategy is that nobody actually believed him, right? That he was actually doing that in earnest. There was reports, for example, that he was going to allow Gidon Saar from the New Hope party to be prime minister first in a rotation. And most people saw that, not that it was a genuine offer to be in a rotation with Saar and that he would voluntarily step down from the prime minister's chair, but rather that it was yet another Netanyahu political trick to insert into the political discourse, Saar might be creating a deal with Netanyahu, and that might create tensions within this emerging coalition where others might think they need to strike a deal with Bibi as well. And so everything with Netanyahu was viewed as a political trick because he's spent the last decade creating political tricks. And you have the graveyard of politicians who strike deals with Netanyahu and who've regretted that they've done so. And now, of course, they've basically conspired against him. And that's why he's been unable to pick off even one. And if you think about how remarkable it is that so many of the members of Knesset joining this new government agree with Netanyahu on everything. basically. And he still cannot convince them to come over because nobody wants to be the friar, as you might say in Israel, right? And so that's the situation we find Netanyahu in. But I don't think he's going away anytime soon. I do think you're going to see very fierce rhetoric coming from him in the opposition regarding the Iran deal and how Naftali Bennett and this new government might be handling the Iran issue vis-a-vis the United States. You're going to see very harsh rhetoric coming from opposition leader Netanyahu about the US-Israel relationship in general. We've already seen Netanyahu suddenly start talking about what an awful travesty it would be if the new government enables the United States to open up a consulate in Jerusalem dedicated to relationships with the Palestinians, something the Biden administration has said they intend to do. And so you're going to see all of these pressure points that a Prime Minister Netanyahu may have underplayed as part of coalition politics and as part of his managing the relationship with the United States and Israel. He's going to be unleashed. And that's what I would expect in the near term.
Before I follow up more on the American piece, I want to go back to the role of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and particularly Ram, in all of this, because if we're talking about one of the I don't want to say weakest, but maybe most susceptible coalitions. I mean, as you're saying, every one vote becomes crucial in all of this. So Ram is holding 4 of the seats. So to what extent do they use this as an opportunity to start really pushing forward on advocating for the Arab population that's within Israel, and you know, all of these other pieces? Is Ram going to use it? And I know you were saying that we're not going to likely see anything that's really stark in any direction, and yet it seems like this is their opportunity to really leverage the 4 votes that they have towards some massive changes.
No, totally. It all goes back to the budget and allocation to the Arab sector and various Palestinian communities inside Israel, where there are Palestinian citizens in Israel. If there's a budget that's passed that really delivers on some of those local needs, this could be transformative in terms of how how that sector is viewing engaging in coalition agreements. This is really unprecedented, but that's the gamble that Mansour Abbas, the head of this Ra'am party, he saw that really taking a page from the ultra-Orthodox and how they play politics, how they play the game, right? Is use their numbers to focus on the needs of their particular community and let everything else play itself out, but let me deliver for my particular constituents. And that's also enabled someone like Naftali Bennett of the far right, or of the hardline national religious right. I think he's made comments recently to the effect that he was prepared for a coalition with Mansour Abbas and Ra'am, whereas he was not with Ayman Odeh and the Joint List, because Mansour Abbas and Ra'am were focused on the needs of their community and not what he called nationalist views, meaning not putting forward the Palestinian issue and a focus on the Palestinian issue at the front and center. And there was also comments made by Naftali Bennett in an interview that he gave with the Israeli journalist Amit Segel just a few days ago at a kind of a primetime event. And they were asked, what's the difference between the opposition of Bennett to creating a deal with Ayman Odeh's faction of the Arab Joint List Party versus the Arab Ra'am Party, the Islamist party. And one of the things that he noted is Mansour Abbas's going to Lod after the recent Jewish-Arab violence and going to a synagogue that had been destroyed and pledging to work to heal the rifts inside Israeli society, demonstrated that Mansour Abbas was willing to focus on the well-being of Israel, and as Bennett put it, put national issues aside, is the way that he framed it. So it's going to be a test for Israeli society in terms of whether they're able to deliver significant change, but also obviously for Ra'am, this is a major move, and it could have ramifications for years to come in terms of the entire sector of Palestinian citizens in Israel and how they choose to engage in the Israeli political system. And so it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays itself out. But I do think the name of the game is, what does that budget include for the Arab sector?
And so now I'm forgetting exactly what was in the graphic, but the religious parties are not part of this coalition?
Not at all.
Which is also pretty unusual, right?
It's been unusual in the last 2 decades, for sure, if not more so. We have the major ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas, United Torah Judaism, outside together with the Likud and Ayman Odeh's joint list are all sitting on the outside. In the last 2 days, in particular yesterday, the Israeli media in this morning is abuzz about the speeches given yesterday. There was a joint press conference held by both the Ashkenazi and Sephardic, religious factions, which were just, frankly, pretty terrible. They were saying that Naftali Bennett should take off his kippah, and in the ultra-Orthodox framing, the biggest insult is to call someone a Reform Jew. And repeatedly, Yaakov Litzman, the head of the United Torah Judaism faction, said repeatedly, he's simply a reform. He's simply reform. He's no longer, Jewish, et cetera, sort of attacking Naftali Bennett as not really being religious and not really having any, there's been a lot of talk about this being the first prime minister to wear a kippah. This is the first religious Orthodox observant prime minister. And yesterday's announcements were really an effort by the ultra-Orthodox factions, UTD and Shas, to really pull the rug under the notion that this is a victory for observance inside Israel. And they really went on a blistering attack yesterday that really, frankly, much of it, I think, at least the media reports, is showing just how hysterical they were. And of course, they were offensive in a lot of the things that they had to say. I don't expect that there's going to be dramatic changes impacting the issues of religion and state, with a couple really notable things. We've already seen reports about the deal around the prayer space at the Western Wall likely back on the table. The pluralistic section, that the deal that was struck that was then reneged upon, is likely back on the table. And we might see some form of draft law regarding the enlistment of some in the ultra-Orthodox sector to the IDF back on the table. That, of course, was one of the issues that led Avigdor Lieberman to begin with to withdraw from the government and spark all of this election madness. So there are definitely things that are going to be on the table and potentially advanced that these ultra-Orthodox parties are going to not be happy with. And we've seen them flailing in the last 24 hours in a major, major way to try it again, to create public pressure against this coalition actually taking shape.
So let's go back, let's shift to America, because I think there's a lot that's happening here also, and when I think about our American Jewish community, it's often our relationship to Israel has to do more with who we are and our own identity. And so it seems to me, but correct me if my assessment is wrong. I mean, it seems to me that in recent years, Prime Minister Netanyahu has spent a lot of time, he's put all of his eggs into the basket of the Republican Party, very famously when he went to Congress and slighted Obama, the relationship with Trump, and ways in which I think we're seeing a lot of division within the American Jewish community around who tend to overwhelmingly vote Democrat, but are seeing this rhetoric of more alliance with Israel with Republicans. And then you had the quote from Ron Dermer also talking about catering more to the evangelical community, which tends to be more in the Republican Party. So to what extent is Naftali Bennett as prime minister working to bridge some of that or repair some of those relationships? Or to what extent is opposition leader Netanyahu making all of that worse? Or is none of this playing out in America and we're all irrelevant to this conversation?
It's a really good question. If you would have told me Naftali Bennett as prime minister, what's it going to mean for U.S.'s relations and diaspora relations, I would have been very, very concerned. But Naftali Bennett as prime minister of this government, where he does not really have the ability to advance what he has articulated as his clear agenda, particularly vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue. I do think there are reasons to be optimistic, actually, in terms of the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and particularly with regard to Israel-diaspora relation, or yes, Israel-diaspora relation. Number one is something that has nothing to do with anything that we talked about thus far, and that's Israel's new president. Poor Isaac Herzog, who, I shouldn't say poor Isaac Herzog, because he got named president last week, but he got named president on the same day that all of this political drama was happening. I was joking that he couldn't even own a news cycle, the poor guy. But, you know, I think we all, I'm sure many people on this call have met and had conversations with Isaac Herzog, because he has been a tremendous ambassador for the state of Israel to diaspora Jews, not only in Israel as head of the Jewish Agency, but even before that, when he was a minister and the head of the Labor Party. Of course, someone that knows very, very intimately the American Jewish experience, having gone to high school here in New York when his father was ambassador to the United Nations. And long moons ago was one of the founders of our organization, actually. But I think that Isaac Herzog will bring to the presidency a ceremonial role for sure, but I think he will bring to the presidency a real desire to begin to engage diaspora Jewish communities and bring the diaspora Jewish community story to Israelis in a way that I think will be very refreshing for many of us in the diaspora. That's number one. Number two is that we are going to see a very powerful Yair Lapid, who is the largest party in this government, serving as foreign minister, presenting a completely new face. We've seen Gabi Ashkenazi as foreign minister under a Netanyahu government, where that role was really diminished in terms of, it wasn't a high profile. You didn't see Ashkenazi be front and center that often because, again, Ashkenazi, even though he was foreign minister, he was not even the head of his party. That was Benny Gantz as defense minister and the alternate prime minister. I think the role of foreign minister will be elevated given the nature of this coalition, and you're likely to see much more of Yair Lapid engaging with the United States and even with diaspora communities. And I think that, frankly, the idea that what we're seeing is leadership that is not Benjamin Netanyahu will be refreshing for many. And I will say not only in Washington, where Netanyahu, you're rightly commented, is really blamed for a lot of the growing tension between Democrats and Republicans, because Netanyahu so clearly began to be identified as kind of the Republican prime minister of Israel. But really young American Jews, and I would argue young Israelis as well, who have not known a different leader of Israel, who cannot remember the time when the prime minister of Israel was not Benjamin Netanyahu. Right? If you're 20 years old right now, you're in college campuses, you don't even know what it's like to see an Israel with a different leader. And I think that's healthy to see Israel democracy evolving and showing itself in a different way. Do I think that Netanyahu can cause trouble from the opposition? Absolutely. And the question will be, is this alliance that we've seen emerge over recent years between Netanyahu and Trump, or the Likud party and the Republican Party, if that's sustained when the Likud party is in the opposition? I certainly think that Netanyahu will not hold back in his criticisms of the Biden administration going forward. And that will cause damage, further damage, certainly to Netanyahu's profile vis-a-vis Democrats. And should Netanyahu somehow return to the prime minister's chair, that will only further I think, ignite some of the growing tensions that we've seen recently between Democrats and Republicans. Having said that, the growing split is that we've been seeing in Washington on these issues is not going away simply because Netanyahu will no longer be prime minister. There are still substantive disagreements. You're not going to see an Israel that's suddenly totally fine and kosher with whatever the Biden administration wants to do on the Iran issue, for example. And of course, is not really going to have, this government's not going to be able to do some of the things I'm sure that the Biden administration is going to want to see advance, or is not going to be eager, let's say, to be doing some of the things the Biden administration needs to see or would like to see happen. going back to those issues identified before, a political solution on the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan issue, which is going to be incredibly tricky, or even the consulate issue, which again, Netanyahu is going to make very, very tricky, but are objectives of the Biden administration. So there will continue to be tensions. I do think there's going to be a kind of a relief that Netanyahu is out of the scene, and that there can be a kind of fresh start in a way, in a dialogue with a new cast of characters. And through it all, I think the diaspora Jews, and from many respects, have a lot to point to that is actually a reason for optimism, whether it's on the religious pluralism issues, like I mentioned before, in the Western Wall Plaza, that are of concern to many in the diaspora community, or it's simply seeing leadership that identifies the concerns and interests of the diaspora community, whether that's in the form of Lapid or in Bougie Herzog as president. And I do want to make note that as much as I may politically disagree with the views of Naftali Bennett, he also understands the diaspora experience, having he is the child of Americans who moved to Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War. He lived in New York for a few years, is someone that is familiar, certainly more familiar with the American Jewish experience than most. And so, I think there are reasons for optimism in that regard.
Well, it's nice to hear some optimism. So this might be a total shift, but we only have a few minutes left, and I'm curious, is there any talk of Palestinian elections? Like anything on that front?
So there is not anything on that front as of yet. Technically, the Palestinian elections that were supposed to be held, the first was supposed to be held in May. There was going to be a cycle of 3 elections. They were all officially postponed, yet to be rescheduled. Of course, the issue, once again, as it was when we had Palestinian elections, I think it was 2007, the same dynamic was beginning to emerge, where the Fatah party, the party affiliated with Mahmoud Abbas, who leads the Palestinian Authority, and the PLO, it's essentially split into 3 separate factions, warring against themselves, against the united Hamas faction, setting up the possibility that the Fatah vote would be split in 3 different directions, and the Hamas vote would emerge victorious, which is exactly what happened some 14 years ago. And so that's essentially why Abbas decided to postpone those elections. But this time there is really growing animosity, growing angst against the Palestinian leaderships not holding elections. Of course, Hamas recognized that and saw the growing tensions in Jerusalem as an opportunity to assert its role as defending the interests of the Palestinians and sparking this round of violence. But the diminishing credibility of Mahmoud Abbas and legitimacy of Abbas as the leader is something that the Biden administration certainly must be concerned about. And it is not so simple when thinking about when elections may be held, how to bolster the position of a united Fatah list before we can talk, frankly, about Fatah, Hamas, and reconciliation between the West Bank and Gaza and all the negotiations that entails, and whether it's even possible. The first order of business will be reconciliation within the Fatah party, within Fatah, on not only what is their, how can they enter into a future election united, but what is the plan after Abbas? Abbas now 86 years old, heart condition, smokes a pack a day. This is all, the only certainty in the Middle East is that Abbas cannot live forever. And I think that the uncertainty within Fatah about what happens the day after is something that needs to be addressed if Fatah is to emerge into a legitimate Palestinian election and to emerge victorious. Because I want to underscore, I do not think it is that Hamas is eminently popular in both the West Bank and Gaza and is going to emerge with this strong mantle of leadership. I think what we're seeing is a splintering of Fatah into three distinct factions, Abbas's faction, Dahlan's faction, and increasingly the Barghouti Nasser al-Qidwa faction. And what may emerge within that faction, I think, is something that the administration needs to be watching carefully. Last thing I'll say on this is, if the goal is to bolster Fatah and the Palestinian Authority vis-a-vis Hamas, the danger in this post-Gaza conflict scenario, and Michael Koplow, our policy director, who I know you guys are all familiar with, has written about this, is that it is not enough to enable the Palestinian Authority, led by the Fatah party, to be responsible for Gaza reconstruction, essentially making them responsible for cleaning up Hamas's mess. It is not necessarily a political boost for Fatah or the Palestinian Authority to give them the keys to that reconciliation, because you're essentially giving them the keys to clean up Hamas's mess. What is needed is a political win that is done on their terms, is not done as a reaction to something Hamas did, but as an actual political win that the Palestinian Authority can show the Palestinian people that diplomacy, not violence, works. And what that political win can be against the backdrop of an Israeli government that is going to be very hesitant from shaking and rocking the boat all that much, is where I think the real policy making and decision making will be most interesting to watch, between needing to accomplish that political victory to show diplomacy works, and recognizing both the possibilities that may emerge and also the limitations of this very diverse and new Israeli coalition government.
So I'll just, and there's one last question I asked, just having to do with whether Palestinians or the Arab population, do they have a preference in terms of what we've talked about of like, do they see this new government as in any way better for them than Netanyahu administration? Or I would add as an alternative, are they so I can't think of, dissuaded from the whole process that it's not really a choice of one or the other?
No, I think they're not enthusiastic about this change. I think even as they may be excited to see Netanyahu leave the scene, there is going to be very little expectation that anything will change. And given what I just outlined in terms of the likelihood that we're not going to see major moves, that means more of the status quo. And while the status quo may be of interest for the Israelis at this moment, the status quo is certainly not in the interests of many Palestinians who see what is maybe not official annexation, but creeping annexation taking place throughout the West Bank, an increasingly authoritarian Palestinian Authority that is silencing any form of real democratic participation or engagement, without any horizon for political change, as we just discussed, without elections in the near term. And that is a status quo that is worrying and concerning, and also leaving many Palestinians to be resigned that nothing is going to change, regardless of who the Israeli leadership is. And even more so, reason for pessimism would be that at the head of this government is Naftali Bennett, who many Palestinians will be very familiar as being the kind of annexationist in chief in terms of what he is seeking to accomplish in terms of transforming Area C, 60% of the West Bank, again, from what was originally intended as a transitional designation to be part of a future Palestinian state into fully endorsed, annexed Israeli territory. None of this is good news from the Palestinian side of things, and what will be something, again, into the nitty-gritty of negotiations and what this government can or can't do. One of the things to watch is Merav Michaeli is the head of the transportation ministry. She is the head of the Labor Party. She is in charge of the allocation of resources for infrastructure. And this is a key post vis-a-vis new roads and bypass roads and all sorts of roads that will connect or provide access for Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And there's already lots of talk from the Israeli settler community, again, a community that was originally Naftali Bennett's base, to say, there's no way that our cause of settlement in the West Bank can be advanced as long as Merav Michaeli is transportation minister, because we're not going to see the necessary roads built and infrastructure in place for us to expand settlements. So while there are reasons there to think some of that will not be advanced, there's enough in place and enough momentum to have Palestinians continue to be pessimistic, frankly, about there being any meaningful change in terms of a political horizon with the current government.
David, thank you so much. This has been so eye-opening for me and so helpful, and I'm grateful to you for taking the time in the middle of the day. I'm grateful to everyone here who joined during your lunch hour. I'm hopeful that I know we've often done this immediately post elections, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to talk more and learn more, but not because of we'd like to, I think, all see a little less elections and a little more work happening. But just thank you so much for clarifying all of it, for going through all of it in so much detail, and for taking your time to answer all of these questions.
Thanks so much, Rory. Thanks everyone for joining, and maybe one day in St. Louis in person.
Yes, well, we're happy to. As soon as we're able to, we'd love to host you, and then you and I have all this catching up to do. So
yeah, for sure. All right, thank you, Rory. Thanks everybody.
Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.